This is the Content Marketing Podcast, episode number 173, Storytelling Made Simple, an interview with Ron Ploof, author of the StoryHow pitch deck. Hello and welcome to the Content Marketing Podcast. This is the show where we help you attract and retain business through the power of quality content. I'm your host, Rachel Parker of Resonance Content Marketing, and today is May 5th, 2016. Hello, or as we say in Texas, howdy, and thank you for joining us for today's episode of the Content Marketing Podcast. Just a reminder, this podcast is available on iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and now on Google Play Music. So if you like what you hear, please feel free to click over and subscribe so you can get every single episode delivered directly to your happy little ears. I also want to invite you to subscribe to our weekly tip emails. Yes, every Friday we send out a quick content marketing tip, and that also includes links to the weekly video and our weekly blog post, as well as to this podcast. To subscribe, just go to resonancetips.com. Last week, we wrapped up our discussion of content marketing for IT brands by talking about how to create effective content when your product is technical and your audience is not. If you happen to miss that episode, feel free to check it out on iTunes or Stitcher or via the RSS feed. Today we turn our attention to storytelling, and our special guest, Ron Ploof of StoryHow, will tell us about a new tool that makes storytelling simple and, maybe even fun? But first it's time to check in with our news feed for this week's rundown of news you can use. Got some news out of Snapchat kicking off our news feed today. Now remember, I've been telling you to keep an eye on Snapchat. It is really starting to catch on, and not just among the younger crowd. A lot of marketers are really starting to take a second look at it as a marketing tool. Well, Snapchat has reported that its users are now watching 10 billion videos a day on the app. 10 billion, and that is up from 8 billion just 3 months ago. So Snapchat is growing at a ridiculously fast pace. And just a general comment about the app. Yes, the demo still skews towards the younger crowd. The tweens and the early 20 folks are using it. But remember, we were saying the same thing about Facebook just a few years ago, and look where that has gotten to. So if you have not given Snapchat at least a look for your marketing, I'm not saying you have to jump in with both feet, but just give it a look at what other people are doing with it, and make a decision as to whether it would fit into your marketing schema. I think you would serve yourself very well by giving it a look. Okay, some news out of Periscope also. Now, with Blab getting all the live streaming video attention, we haven't heard a whole lot out of Periscope, but they have introduced a couple of cool new features. First of all, some new audience statistics. Periscope has announced that users, now this is iOS users currently, they now have access to new audience statistics such as the number of viewers, the time watched, and you can also see a graph of viewers over time to find your broadcasts, which of your broadcast moments got the most reach. So that's one new feature. And the other, which I believe is also iOS only for the moment, is Periscope has introduced a sketching tool. So when you are scoping, you have access to a tool that lets you draw with your finger, and you would just draw on your screen, and the audience would see like you're drawing on a whiteboard, and which would be great if you are doing something instructional or you want to point something out. You can circle things, you can draw arrows, draw smiley faces if you want to, but you can add those elements while you scope. So a couple of very cool features out of Periscope. Okay, our content hit of the week is called The Secret to Content Marketing ROI. This is by Michael Brenner on the Content Marketing Institute blog. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this post is that this is a never-ending conversation. What's the ROI? What am I going to get out of content marketing in terms of revenue? And I struggle with it myself, especially when I am working with a client who is just getting on board with content marketing. Well, in this post, Michael presents very well and very clearly how we can build that business case for content marketing and answer those ROI questions before we even really get started. He does it very, very well. This is a great resource. And of course, I will share the link in the blog post for this episode. Okay, that's it for this week's update. If you stumble across a little gem you think might be of interest to your fellow content marketers, please tweet it to me at Resonance CONT, Resonance Content with the ENT lopped off, so that we can share. Now it's time for this week's Spotlight segment, Storytelling Made Simple with Ron Ploof of StoryHow. Ron Ploof helps enterprises use story structure to make their messages interesting, memorable, and persuasive. His StoryHow method consists of 3 simple components: roles, events, and influences. He's the author of the StoryHow Pitch Deck, a deck of playing cards that prompts its users through the process of converting their ideas, messages, and presentations into memorable stories. He also writes a blog at storyhow.com. So without further ado, here is our special guest, Ron Ploof, who is going to tell us about storytelling made simple. Hey, Ron, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rachel.
Great to have you. Well, hey, I just gave our audience your official bio, but can you give us a little bit more personal introduction to who you are and what you do?
Sure. I came to storytelling in a weird way. My degree is in electrical engineering. And so I designed chips for a living many, many years ago. But I've always been a storyteller. It didn't matter whether I went the science route or not, that I've always tried to find interesting ways of explaining things, especially technical concepts. And as I went through my career, through engineering and then sort of to the sales side of engineering, I found that I was most effective when I spoke in terms of story as opposed to shooting people with bullet points.
Right. Those bullet points do hurt after a while, I gotta say.
Bullets kill people.
They do. So, Ron, I am down here in oil and gas country here in Houston and know quite a few engineers myself, and I know very few among that group who are good storytellers. So you have a unique blend of skill sets there, my friend.
Yeah, I like to say that when you graduate from engineering school, they usually surgically remove your personality. But I was absent that day.
Okay.
Engineering is tough because it's a meritocracy, right? They really don't care about your background. They just care about what you can do.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that if you actually take story apart and you look at story structure, I usually blow engineers and scientists away when I say that, look, if you take a look at story and how it's structured, it's no different than the scientific method. They're the same thing. Wow. And then once you get them seeing that story isn't soft and that it's actually hard in terms of a skill, a hard skill as opposed to a soft one, they come around.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. It's funny. I just I shared a quote on social media the other day, which is perfect to lead into our conversation. Flannery O'Connor once said, "Most people know exactly what a story is until they sit down to write one."
Amen.
So tell me a little bit about how you initially came up with the StoryHow pitch deck.
So I've actually been a podcast producer of a storytelling podcast for 10 years. I just came into my 11th year. It's a storytelling podcast called Griddle Cakes Radio. So I've been known as a storyteller out in the podosphere, if you will. And as people were talking with me, and we were starting to see in the Harvard Business Review and the Huffington Post and the Wall Street Journal that the word storytelling kept coming up over and over and over in terms of business. But what I was finding was that they kept rehashing the same things. They would talk about, oh, you need to think about sitting around the campfire. I hate that analogy.
It wreaks havoc on the fire codes too, I got to say.
Yeah. And so, or they would keep saying things like, oh, they'd go to the entertainment industry and they'd say that we need a rising action, a falling action, and a denouement. And I don't know about you, but in marketing, we typically don't use those terms.
Right.
And so, or they'll go to, you need to know the 17 steps of the hero's journey for Joseph Campbell. And if you want to get people's eyes to glaze over, just tell them that, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. 17 of
That
anything. I mean,
yeah, exactly, 17 of anything.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that any of these things are wrong,
Right.
but what I was trying to do is seeing, is there a way to explain storytelling, but I wanted to use the language of business, the language that people
Mm.
use every day in business. And so as I started digging into that, because as a storyteller, I really never thought about how I told a story. And it
Mhm.
took me a while to just dig in, look at stories, and start to take some notes until finally I came around with these categories and these specific little things that are in stories. And I tried to figure out a way to put them together. At first, I thought about writing a book, but the whole idea of cards and physical media, something that someone can play with,
Yeah.
really excited me, and so I decided to put it into a physical deck form as opposed to a book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. So you shared a little bit about a lot of the guru advice that's wandering around. What are you seeing in terms of actual stories, either actual stories or people that or things that people call stories that you see out there in the business world? What are they doing right and what are they doing wrong?
Well, every now and then I'll see something that I do like.
Mm-hmm.
I think I saw something from Dell recently where they were showing kind of the future of technology, and they followed the story of a little girl who needed a heart transplant.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're definitely using the elements of story, and I like that. The reason that I like it is because they're actually attacking story the way that most companies don't. The
Mm-hmm.
biggest mistake that companies make is they make their product the hero of the
Yes.
story.
Mm-hmm.
I liken it to the story of King Arthur, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
King Arthur is the hero of your story.
Right.
Excalibur plays a minor role in
Mm-hmm.
the story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just because it's a minor role, it doesn't mean that it's not important, because we know that King Arthur cannot rule Camelot without Excalibur.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you can get your company to come around to the fact that, look, our product plays a minor role in our hero customer's story,
Mm-hmm.
now you're coming at it from a very different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know when I speak about storytelling, I always put a slide up of it's a scene from The Empire Strikes Back with Luke wandering around the swamps with Yoda on his back. And I say, okay, where is your brand in this picture? And they say, oh, well, we're the Skywalker, of course. I say, no, you're the Yoda. You're the supporter. You're the wise advisor, the counselor.
Yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
it really comes down to the fact that if I try to tell you that I am the hero in your story,
Mm-hmm.
it's silly and arrogant.
Mm-hmm.
Really,
Mm-hmm.
that's what it comes down to. I like to say that the most important attribute that a storyteller, especially a business storyteller, can have is empathy for their
Mm-hmm.
audience.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
typically, we don't have empathy for our audience, especially in marketing.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the words that we use to describe, we organize campaigns to target people so that they will engage with us and we can capture them.
Nice.
Those don't sound like words of empathy. They sound like
Right.
something to conquer. We're
Mm-hmm.
going to drive them to our website, throw a roadblock in front of them, and then blast them with emails. We don't use terms of empathy.
Yeah.
And if you start to think in terms of your audience with empathy, where are
Mm-hmm.
they coming from? What do they need to know in order to approach you or purchase your product or service? You're in
Mm-hmm.
a much better place to tell them a story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So Ron, just to get into a little bit more of the structure of the deck, you've got it uh, blocked out into four color-coded categories. Tell me a little bit about those categories and how they work.
Yeah. So there are four suits. I like to say
Mm-hmm.
that there are three elements to every story. I define a story as the result of people pursuing what they want.
Mm-hmm.
And so that actually lines up with the three elements of every story. There are people, roles, that's one of the categories in the deck.
Mm-hmm.
There are events, the things that happen to those people.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third category would be influences, the things that are influencing their decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Want is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the three elements that are in any story. You can
Mm-hmm.
break it down to that. The fourth category are techniques for moving those three elements around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very simple. And then as people start just pop the box open and start looking at this, you recommend that they start with the starter deck, which is the first two cards from each suit. Is that accurate?
Yeah, as I was testing the deck before final manufacture, that there were people. I found that I had my left brains and my right brains. All right,
Mm-hmm.
my right brains would just dive right in and
Mm-hmm.
go for it. My left brains were like, nah, how do you want me to use this thing? And so what I did is I decided to see if I could come up with just a simpler version of the deck. And
Mm-hmm.
what the starter hand is the first two cards of each deck, two roles, two events, two influences, and two techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go through these cards, you can kind of get an idea on how your story can be structured,
Right.
some great questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want, you can start to use the other cards as you get more comfortable with them and go
Mm-hmm.
deeper.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. And one thing I find interesting, Ron, is in the event cards that are the starter deck, you've got the initial impulse and the ending. So the ending needs to be something that we start thinking about very early on.
You know, Stephen Covey, habit number one is begin with the end in mind,
There
right?
you go. Mm-hmm.
If you don't know where you're going, it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of hard to start the journey.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's real important for you to figure out. It's probably more important to figure out how you're going to end as opposed to how you're going to begin.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And that's another thing I see so often in business stores is that they start strong and then they kind of meander around and then they just finish. I mean, they just stop. There's no real resolution.
Yeah, and that is such a dissatisfying experience for someone who's sitting and listening to the story.
Mhm, mhm. Yep, exactly. Especially after you've invested, 10, 15 minutes, which on the web is an eternity, reading the story.
Absolutely. And
Mhm,
there again, if you haven't figured out how to make that a satisfying ending for your customers, you probably didn't have empathy for them in the first place.
mhm, mhm. Yep, exactly. So looking further down the starter deck, the influence cards we have here are number one, Jeopardy, and number two, an emotional choice. So
Yeah.
how do those fit in?
Well, in business,
Mhm.
and business is the perfect definition of a story, right?
Yep.
People pursuing what they want. Well, a lot of times to get what you want involves risk.
Mm,
Part
mhm.
of the great game of business is negotiation,
Sure.
where what you're trying to do is you're trying to find out which side of the negotiation is going to take the most risk.
Mhm.
And so for Jeopardy, a lot of times marketers don't think about the risks that their customers have to take in order to um, purchase their product. That
Mhm.
there are risks, that maybe they have budget that's been allocated for one thing
Yep.
and they now need to not do that thing to take yours.
Mhm.
Maybe there's the old saying, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, very old saying,
Mhm.
that maybe they are going to not buy the blue chip and they're going to actually go after a startup. Maybe there's risk involved. Maybe their jobs are on the line.
Mhm.
So you have to think about the risk. If you
Yeah.
can actually address the risk, the
Mhm.
real risk that people go through in your stories,
Mhm.
people will relate with it
Yeah.
because they see it as risk. But
Mhm.
again, in typical traditional marketing, everything's supposed to be sunshine and roses. You're
Right.
not supposed to talk about the risks, but
Mhm.
really that's what connects with people because it's real.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep, exactly. And then looking a little further, the technique cards in that deck are purpose and meaning. And I thought that it was particularly interesting to conclude those at the beginning because your story it's the so what, right? The so what behind your story. What's the point?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the purpose is for you, the storyteller. Why are you telling the story? Of
Mm-hmm.
the hundreds or thousands of stories that you could tell,
Mm-hmm.
why are you telling this one? What is the purpose? What do you want? I mean, you play a role in this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want? Yeah, I know you may want your customer to purchase a product or service, but what do you want?
Mm-hmm.
Why are you telling it? And then the meaning. You need to think about what it means to them. It is exactly the so what question
Mm-hmm.
that we know what we're trying to do. We
Right.
now have our purpose, but what does it mean to them?
Mm.
And I go back to something that I learned many, many years ago is that a benefit isn't a benefit until it comes from your customer's mouth.
Mm.
So we can sit around as marketers and come up with all the benefits. It's not a benefit until it comes from the customer's mouth. Think about the benefits to them,
Mm-hmm.
what it means to them, and now you have another good,
Mm-hmm.
solid piece of the foundation of your story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. So we put together our starter deck. So we're starting to frame our story. So talk a little bit about how we can go into the rest of the deck and use that in different ways and different approaches.
Well, now that we understand that the foundation of any story is a story as the result of people pursuing what they want, we can now start to build upon that and add a structure on top of that foundation.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite structure comes from Ken Adams,
Mm-hmm.
who is someone who is very big in improv,
Mm-hmm.
and he describes it as the story spine. And the story spine goes like this: once upon a time, every day, then one day, and because of that, until finally.
Wow.
Very simple.
Mm-hmm.
Describes any story.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I had alluded to earlier that the story spine is the same as the scientific method.
Yep.
We observe, we make premises, we test, and we conclude. It's the
Mm-hmm.
same thing.
Wow.
So, if we can now use the roles, the events, and the influences
Mm-hmm.
and put them into a structure, the most important thing, the thing that the human mind jumps onto, is change.
Mm.
It's the and then one day.
Mm-hmm.
We need to find our and then one day. Once you do that, and you look at it from your customer's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
that once upon a time, everything was fine, and then one day something happened,
Mm-hmm.
and because of that, they went looking for a solution, and because of that, maybe they found your blog post
Mm.
until finally they contacted you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what you have to do. You have to start to think. The reason the deck, I think, works well for people is because it prompts you through the questions that you have to ask in order to put together the information that you're going to put into your story.
Right.
Now, if you can put that information into the story structure,
Mm-hmm.
now you can start to build the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I know one of the techniques that you talk about is taking your starter deck and then picking a random card to add an element to that. So I did a little experimenting myself, started to come up with a very simple story framework, and the card that I picked was an event card called the Meet Cute. So
Yes.
and it tickled me. So tell me about the meet cute and how it enhances that story framework.
It's actually funny that you say that for a couple reasons. But first of all, the meet cute card is, we've seen the meet cute in like a romantic comedy.
Hmm.
It's usually the silly way that the two main characters meet each other,
Hmm.
and typically they don't like each other and they get to like each other. We've seen that before.
Hmm.
Well, that is the meet cute. But
Hmm.
we all have our different ways of having a meet cute. If you think about it, if you ask one of your colleagues, how did we meet? You might have a funny story,
Hmm.
right? And so the meet cute is a great way. Now, the reason I said that it's funny you bring that up is because I was speaking with, yesterday, I was speaking with someone in Belgium who
Hmm.
has been using the StoryHow pitch deck. And he specifically said, my favorite card is the meet cute card, which is card 22.
Uh-huh.
He says, I use it to show how our customers find us.
Mm.
And so it's funny that you called out that card,
Hmm.
and he also mentioned that card. I
Hmm.
had no idea that the meet cute would be that important of a card, but I'm now hearing it twice in 2 days.
Well, there you go. There you go. Maybe your next project should be different ways to approach the meet cute.
I like it.
There we go. There we go. Another card that I stumbled upon, and it's interesting because we talk about roles and we think about roles as people, but the role that I picked was the sacred cow, which is not necessarily people, but assumptions that we need to that present an obstacle for thinking in a new way.
Yeah. So that there are roles that are played in a story, just like I had mentioned that Excalibur plays a
Hmm.
role in the King Arthur story.
Yeah.
That it's not a person, but it is a prop.
Hmm.
And so props do play roles in
Mm.
stories.
Hmm.
And there is the sacred cow, right?
Hmm.
There is that idea that nobody ever questions.
Hmm.
And when nobody ever questions something, that is a great place to look for conflict because
Mm.
let's question it. And I can only see good can come from it. You can either question it and still find out that it's valid,
Sure.
or you can question it and say, you know what, we really need to rethink the way we've been approaching this in the past.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Ron, you go into different ways that one thing I enjoy so much about the deck is it's good for the solo marketer sitting there or the business person trying to work out a story, but it also works for teams and also for agencies working with their clients. It's very versatile.
Yeah, one of the things that I found with agencies is that getting stories from their customers is like pulling teeth.
Amen. I feel you.
It's hard.
Hmm.
And what's funny is a lot of times that they have stories to
Yeah.
tell, but they
Hmm.
just don't think, "Oh, I'm not special or I don't have
Hmm.
anything special." But what they forget is that sometimes they're in a space that's like really cool, but because they're in it, they don't
Yes.
think about it.
Hmm.
And that you can actually use the cards to potentially draw things out of them.
Hmm.
I also have another technique that I like to use to draw stories out of people. And it goes to the fact that our memories are tied to beginnings and endings,
Mm.
bests, worst, happiest, saddest.
Hmm.
And so, if you can actually use some of those polarizing words, it can really help you draw a story out of them. You can say, "Hey, tell me about your best customer. Tell me about your worst customer."
Uh-huh.
Right? Tell me about the first time that you came up with this idea to solve this problem. If you
Hmm.
use those alphas and those omegas, it
Hmm.
can really help people unlock some memories, and you can get some good stories from them.
Hmm. Hmm. And I absolutely agree with you, Ron. People are teeming with stories, but we don't think them as stories. It's just stuff that happened, and we don't think of it in terms of a capital S story that could be going out there and working for our brands. It's just stuff.
It is,
Hmm.
and I'll tell you, story to me is a difficult word because
Hmm.
I think it comes with so much connotation behind it.
Hmm.
Um, on one hand, if you do think in that stupid campfire example, right?
Right.
You're all sitting around singing "Kumbaya" around a fire. Like, what does that have to do with business?
Hmm.
Um, on the other side, people know that story is very powerful. I mean,
Hmm.
they definitely understand. I mean, we wouldn't spend $13 to sit in a crowded movie theater with perfect strangers for 2 hours watching lights flickering on a screen,
Hmm.
something that really sounds like something they do at Gitmo, but pay $13 for the privilege. We wouldn't do that.
Hmm.
The only thing holding us in our seats is the power of story. So they
Sure.
understand the power of story. But making that jump
Yeah.
between using story in their business is difficult. And
Hmm.
hopefully, like something like the StoryHow pitch deck can help, or then even using techniques like the alpha and omega that I had mentioned earlier.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep, absolutely.
And
So,
once you get them going,
hmm.
they don't shut up. That's the
That's
great
true.
thing. No, really. Once you get them
Yeah.
going and they get the hang of it and they say, "Oh, wait a
Yeah.
minute, I have another story and I have
Uh-huh.
another story."
Right.
And just turn on the recorder and record them all and you'll be able to use them later.
Exactly. Exactly. You've got fodder for years. Exactly. Yeah, I find that too. Once I get my clients thinking in that along the lines of that story, they email me, "Oh, I got this story. I got this story. I got another story. Let's put this in the blog. Let's put this in," and it's wonderful because it kind of re-sparks their own excitement about what they do.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, Ron, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that you about something you heard from a customer of yours in Belgium. Are there any other particularly striking bits of feedback that you've heard from users of the deck that come to mind?
I think one of my favorite stories is it actually comes out of the financial industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you, when I put this deck together again, I had no idea of this application.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's really satisfying when you hear someone using your product in a way that you never expected.
Mm-hmm.
It's an and then one day.
Mm-hmm.
So she is a loan underwriter,
Mm-hmm.
and she bought the StoryHow pitch deck because her job is to evaluate loans
Mm-hmm.
and write a report and then make a recommendation on whether the bank should fund that loan or not.
Mm-hmm.
And what she found is that, sometimes just looking at the raw numbers, they may look worse than they actually are
Yeah.
because there's no backstory behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's being taken over by someone who in the past where she's a turnaround agent, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so she's used to coming in and taking over bad companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
But turning them around.
Right.
Well, if that isn't represented in the report,
Right.
then there's no way to evaluate it. So she uses the StoryHow pitch deck to write loan recommendation reports.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was fascinating.
Wow, that is very very unique. Unique application. Wonderful. Well, what other industries do you hear from, Ron, of people who are using your deck in interesting ways?
I hear from people in PR.
Mm-hmm.
So PR, definitely agencies. Um, there are a bunch of places that do use the StoryHow pitch deck,
Mm-hmm.
and every now and then I just hear of a new one. Like I
Mm-hmm.
said, it could be technology.
Yeah,
It could be it really can be used everywhere.
sure.
And I'm drawing a blank on some very specific examples. But every
Mm-hmm.
now and then I get an email, and it's another one of these stories that I just
Right.
never anticipated in the past.
Right, right, wonderful. Well, it's been so interesting, Ron, to hear the story behind the story how pitch deck. So if our listeners would like to know more about it or pick up their own pitch deck, where would they go on the World Wide Web?
Sure. So if they want to know more about the pitch deck, or they can go to storyhow.com.
Hmm.
Also, they can go to amazon.com and
Okay.
do a search for StoryHow pitch deck because that's where they can buy it.
Okay. And I understand you also have a webinar coming up very soon. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've been working on a webinar, and it won't be out until probably late May.
Okay.
But one of the things that I am working on is a webinar called "How to Make a Presentation Interesting,
Mm.
Memorable, and Persuasive."
Wow.
And what we'll do is we'll walk through using the StoryHow method, roles, events, and influences, and then seeing if we can take your idea, your big idea, and put it into a story.
Wow, wonderful. And presentations, oh my goodness, if there was ever a haven for bad storytelling, it would be presentations.
Yes, absolutely. The guy that I spoke with yesterday, Sebastian, he was saying that that's what he did.
Hmm.
Is that he brought the StoryHow pitch deck into his organization.
Hmm.
It's an insurance company. They sell mortgage
Mm.
insurance and
Hmm.
credit protection services,
Hmm.
and that he says most of our presentations are always about numbers because his business is about numbers.
Sure.
But rather than just presenting the numbers, he told a story about a user and
Yeah.
how they were helping him.
Hmm.
And then once he went back to the numbers, he said that they now had meaning.
Yeah.
And
There you go.
he has gotten so good at this type of presentation that senior management is now asking him to take a look at their presentation. So
Wow.
yes, it can be used well.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Absolutely. And then finally, Ron, I understand you also have a newsletter. Tell us about that.
Yeah, if you go to storyhow.com, you can
Hmm.
sign up for the Dragon Slayer Digest.
Woohoo.
It is a weekly newsletter,
Hmm.
so it comes out every Monday morning. And
Hmm.
essentially, there'll be there's 5 items. It's the same format every time. It's a link to my most recent blog post because I publish one every Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are 3 stories that I've found in the wild on business storytelling. So examples of people using business storytelling. And then the last piece is a little StoryHow challenge, where I give you a little challenge to incorporate storytelling into your personal and private lives.
Wonderful.
And professional lives. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. And of course, when you get that webinar scheduled, you will let us know through the newsletter.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Ron, this has been a lot of fun, and I can't wait to get back to my story deck and start writing some to my pitch deck and start creating some new stories. This is great.
Rachel, this was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and hey, let's have you back real soon. Okay.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Okay. Thanks. Many thanks again to our special guest, Ron Ploof, for joining us today. That website again is storyhow.com, where you can visit his blog, and you can also sign up for the Dragon Slayer Digest, his weekly email. I have subscribed myself to the Dragon Slayer, and I can tell you it is quite good. Good roundup of storytelling gems from around the web in that given week. Okay, if you have any questions or want to add to the conversation, I would love to hear from you. And the best way to reach me is through the website resonancecontent.com. Now it's time for our content marketing tip of the week. For today's tip, I want to return to a point that Ron made during our conversation. He leveraged an idea from Stephen Covey, which is begin with the end in mind. And, not just in telling stories, I think we need to take that approach with every single piece of content we create. So we're not only looking at who is this for, but what do I want this person to take away after I consume this content? Or as I often put it, I often ask myself, what do I want this person to start doing, stop doing, or do differently as a result of consuming this content? It's really a wonderful focusing exercise. And what it does, keeps us on task, and it prevents us from creating that meandering content that never really goes anywhere. I'm sure you've seen that out on the web many, many times. In fact, sometimes when I begin with the end in mind, I will write that end on a Post-it and put it on my monitor so that I can see it the entire time that I'm creating that content. It really keeps me on task and on the mission for that particular piece. So every time you create content, whether it's a single tweet or a full online course, begin with the end in mind, and you will serve your audience as well with focused content that keeps them coming back. Okay, campers, that's it for me today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Content Marketing Podcast. Many thanks again to our special guest, Ron Ploof of StoryHow. If you like what you've heard today, please feel free to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or SoundCloud or Google Play Music or via our RSS feed. And if you really like what you've heard, please leave us a quick review on iTunes. I would so appreciate it. Also, remember to sign up for our Tip of the Week emails at resonancetips.com. As I mentioned recently, I have started taking a poetry class, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. So today's poet quote comes from Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She once said, quote, "What is genius but the power of expressing a new individuality?" Unquote. Again, this is Rachel Parker with Resonance Content Marketing. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.